So we are now streaming live. Welcome everybody to our first edition of a six-part series with Sarah Bunin-Benor. Is Bunin the correct pronunciation?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I wanted to make sure because that's important. So we've got we have our launching show tonight where she is going to talk us through one of my favorite questions. I spend far too much time thinking about this question, but without that much sophistication. So do American Jews speak a Jewish language is the question. I'm going to take a second because I'm hearing myself twice actually, because I have a tab open. Yay, live streaming. That's the question we're going to be wrestling with. And it's a thrill to have you, Sarah, hosting this show. For those who are joining the call, the Zoom meeting, you're going to be able to send questions as they arise. Please use the Q&A function to do that. Or you can chat to me, but the Q&A function is preferable. Just use the chat if there's for some reason issues with the video or something like that we need to address. But we're excited to jump in, and we're live streaming onto Facebook and to YouTube, which is a pretty cool thing, and on the Jewish Live website. So I'll pass it over to you, Sarah. Let's jump into Jewish language.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting these events. This is a wonderful service that Jewish Live is providing. I am thrilled to be here today talking to the hundreds of people from all around the world who are currently listening or who will listen later on Facebook or Vimeo or any other platform. And I am here today as the director of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Language Project, which is a new organization that I just started this year. And our goal is to research and teach about Jewish languages. And that begs the question, what is a Jewish language? Well, when I was in college, I had heard of Hebrew, of course, as the Jewish language. And I had heard of Yiddish and I had heard of Ladino, which is also known as Judeo-Spanish. But then one day I was a student at Columbia University in a class on Romance languages, and I read an article about two other Jewish languages, Judeo-Italian and Judeo-Portuguese. I was amazed. I had never heard of these languages before, and I just got really excited about this and started doing more research. And I learned that these were not the only Jewish languages, that wherever Jews have lived, they have spoken a Jewish version of the local language. And you can see here on this map that when Jews were expelled from the land of Israel, this little purple area here, or migrated for various other reasons, they ended up in various parts of North Africa, Europe, and Asia. And they picked up the local language and Judaified it. They spoke Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Tajik, Judeo-Malayalam, Judeo-Amharic, Judeo-Greek, Judeo-Italian, etc., etc. And in fact, the two most famous Jewish languages, Yiddish and Ladino, are exceptions to this history because they were maintained for centuries away from the lands where they originated. Yiddish originated in Germanic lands and then was maintained when Jews moved to Slavic lands. And Ladino began in Spain and was maintained when Jews moved to North Africa and to the Ottoman Empire. And of course, these languages changed as they moved. But what was different about Yiddish and Ladino than these other languages was that they did not live among people who spoke a variety of their same language. Now, what is going on with Jewish languages today? Well, most of them are actually endangered. Yiddish is not. Yiddish is thriving because it is spoken widely in Hasidic communities and Hasidic children speak Yiddish. But most of the other Jewish languages are nearly extinct or moribund. Judeo-Tajik and Judeo-Tat are doing a little bit better because some young people speak them. But most of these languages are endangered. And this is a cause for concern. And some people say things like this. This is from linguist Paul Wexler in 1981. Widespread shifts to non-Jewish languages throughout the world and to revived spoken Hebrew in Israel are now resulting in the obsolescence of contemporary Jewish languages and putting an end to 2,600 years of Jewish language creation. Similarly, cultural critic Leon Wieseltier wrote, "The American Jewish community is the first great community in the history of our people that believes that it can receive, develop, and perpetuate the Jewish tradition not in a Jewish language." Now, I found this strange when I read these quotes because I was a student at Columbia University where there is a large Orthodox Jewish population, and I had a number of Orthodox Jewish friends who would say things like this: "We do all that shtick to be misameach the chatan and kala." Now, is that English? Well, I would say it's Jewish English because it's an English sentence that has some Yiddish words, some Hebrew words, a grammatical construction from Yiddish to be misameach the chatan and kala. And I'm going to give you some other examples of Jewish English. These are videos from YouTube. Actually, I'm not sure if you can hear that. I better make sure that you can.
We can't.
Okay, I'm good. Yeah, I know how to. I know how to fix
cool.
this. Okay, you should be able to
Chodesh Tov, everyone. Today is Rosh Chodesh Adar Aleph. We add this extra month of Adar in order to keep Nisan in the spring, so that Pesach can be celebrated as Chag HaAviv. The question is, what is the significance or status of this extra month of Adar? The Mishnah Megillah clearly states that Purim is always celebrated in Adar Bet, but we're still not really sure what to do with Adar Aleph. The Gemara says, Mish nechnas Adar marbim b'simcha, that when Adar comes around, we're supposed to increase our joy. And the question is, does this apply in Adar Aleph as well? It's a machloket, Rishonim, between the Tosfot, the Rosh, and the Ran. And the Ran does say that in Adar Aleph, we are meant to increase our joy. But with whatever opinion you go by, we still see that we're talking about a marbim b'simcha, an increasing of the joy. What is the status quo of simcha that we're supposed to have?
Okay, you won't be able to hear the answer to that question unless you go and find that video on your own. But you see how she is speaking English with many words from Hebrew, influences from Yiddish, and distinctive pronunciations and intonations. Here's another example. I'm just going to turn up my volume a little bit so you can hear it better. And this is relevant to the time of year when this lecture is being recorded. This is a Pesach themed comedy video.
I said no chametz in the kitchen!
My wife asked me this year, she said, maybe we should go to a hotel. Think watermelon's kosher for kappas? From the inventors of kosher lamp, Mara goggles. It's not a Pesach. It's not a Pesach. They say Pesach program, family program in a hotel for Pesach. It's Pashat, it's not a program, it's not a Pesach. You know, they say the meals are together. They're not together. Everyone's doing their seder, their songs.
Last year for Pesach, my cousin came, whatever he's not so from, he wrapped the entire Madashtana. It was so cool.
You know the Chazon Ish is here for Kazayas? Tefillah, they say good develop.
Okay, so you can see how this is English, but it might be a little hard to understand if you're not familiar with Orthodox Jewish English. Now you might think that this is just a religious thing. Well, it is also used in Orthodox communities in topics that are not about religion. Here is a parody video about baseball using commentary in Orthodox Jewish English or Yeshivish.
Oy vey, it's gone. Gershon Briss, Mefobit with the Akafa, and now the Bnei Malchus have the one-run lead. Now it seems that the Baruch Motto of the Yankees wants to look at the bat. They say, what do you have?
Chaim Lefeir, they discuss in the Machlekes with Chaim Noi Chazon Ish, in the sheer Zefes that wants to put on a bat. Yeah, appears Chaim Noi, 5.7 tefach, according to Chazon Ish. The 4.7 tefach in Lefeir, it seems to be what they're talking about.
They're really hurting over it.
Chaim the Pashtus, they're talking about whether to pass over versus Hakafa and call him a race. Lefeir, it's totally.
Okay, now you see the captions here. Well, you still might not understand it if you're not familiar with Orthodox Jewish English. And in fact, some films use subtitles in dialogue that is in Orthodox Jewish English, where they translate the Hebrew and Yiddish phrases that are used within English sentences. For example, these are stills from Trembling Before God, a film from 2001 about Orthodox Jews. Now you might be saying, well, this is just an Orthodox thing and the rest of us just speak English. Well, that's kind of true. Most non-Orthodox Jews are able to speak English in a way where they are not seen as Orthodox, as Jewish. But you get sentences like this from a Reform rabbi. L'shem chinuch, I am leading a mock Seder tomorrow for our basic Judaism class. I am wondering if anyone out there has already created an essence of Haggadah that is more explanatory than halachic. Thanks in advance for anything you might send my way. I'll teach it all b'shem omro omra. And here's a message that I got from my children's conservative Jewish day school in 2011. Kita Aleph finished the letter Chet this week. We enjoyed singing Hanukkah songs with Mora Debbie and reciting the brachot when lighting the candles. 1C loves Parashat HaShavua. They are always so curious to know what will happen next in the Torah. And even secular Jewish communities use some distinctive language, words from Hebrew or Yiddish. In this case, the Shalom community had this in their email blast. A shout out from Vov class Lehrer Mike to anyone who has a copy of Mouse. So this shows us that Jews of diverse backgrounds speak and write English with distinctive features, especially words from Hebrew and Yiddish. Jews use language to show others not only that they're Jews, but that they're a certain type of Jews. And here are some examples of material culture that indicates a certain type of Jew. And I'm not going to go into this now because this is going to be the topic of a future lecture in this series. So we still have to answer the original question, which is, do American Jews speak a Jewish language? Is all of this distinctive language that I've been showing you actually a Jewish language? Well, it depends what you are defining as a Jewish language. And I would say that the common attributes of Jewish languages are these: has a non-Jewish base language, a Hebrew and Aramaic component, influences from a previous Jewish language, other distinctive features, and a Hebrew writing system. And we'll talk about to what extent Jewish English has each of these. So first, the non-Jewish base language. Yes, Yiddish has the base language of German, Ladino has the base language of Spanish, and Jewish English, obviously the base language is English. Most Jewish communities have a tradition of reciting or reading or studying full texts in Hebrew and Aramaic and translating those texts into their vernacular language and using loan words from Hebrew and Aramaic. And I'll give you examples of these. This is a translation of the Bible, the beginning of Bereshit, Genesis, into Judeo-Persian. So here you see the Hebrew, Bereshit bara, and then here you see Parsi, and then it's a Persian translation. And here is a 20th century Hebrew and Yiddish Bible. Again, you see Bereshit bara over here, the beginning of Genesis, and then here in Onheb hot got, but Bashafen, it's hard to read here, dem Himmel und die Erde. And so it continues the translation in Yiddish. Here's a Judeo-Arabic one that does it in a slightly different way. Here you have the first sentence in Hebrew, Bereshit bara, and then you have it in Aramaic, Bikadmin bara, and then you have it in Judeo-Arabic. And you see that all of these are written in Hebrew letters. We see the same for Jewish Neo-Aramaic, spoken in Kurdistan, in Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And you see the Hebrew on this side, this is a Haggadah, and you see the Aramaic translation on this side. So Chacham ma hu omer and Chacham ma ava gemar. And we have similar translations in Jewish English. Here is a Passover Haggadah graphic novel created in the last year or two. And you see how there is Jewish English, English with some Hebrew words over here, and translations of Manishtana over here, and also the transliteration over here. And this is not written in Hebrew letters. We'll come back to that. So another aspect of translations is that sometimes they are written in a word-for-word manner. That is, they imitate the structure of the Hebrew sentence. So for example, this is a Ladino translation of the beginning of the Torah, Bereshit bara, etc. So you have here, en principio crió el Dios a los cielos y a la tierra. And you can see how that differs from the Spanish. The word order is different, crió el Dios and Dios creo. And the Dio and Dios thing is an interesting feature of Ladino. But you also see these particles, a los cielos y a la tierra, whereas the Spanish doesn't have the a. That is because it imitates the et of the original Hebrew sentence. Now, you don't really get this in Jewish English so much. You don't, I mean, we do say, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, which isn't really so idiomatic in our spoken language. It's a bit archaic, and it does imitate the word order of Hebrew, Baruch, Atah, Adonai, but you don't get this to the same extent that you do in Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, and other traditions, but you get some remnants of it, like that blessing translation, and like the world to come, a translation of Olam Haba, or may her memory be for a blessing, translation of Zichrona Livracha. It doesn't really make sense in English to say may her memory be for a blessing, but it's an imitation of the original Hebrew phrase, or the world to come. It sounds nice in English, but really it's a direct translation, a word-for-word translation of the original Hebrew. A very common feature of Jewish languages is the words that are used from Hebrew and Aramaic within the structure of the language that is spoken. Now, as you might expect, this covers religious items or concepts. Let me give you a few examples. From Judeo-Italian, Judeo-Spanish, and Yiddish, you see these words for the Sabbath, evening prayers, and Jewish holiday. And you see that sometimes it's the same Hebrew word, just pronounced in different ways, Shabbat, Shabbat, and Shabbos. But sometimes it's a different word. Evening prayers is Ashkivenu in Judeo-Italian, using a word from one of those prayers, Aravit in Judeo-Spanish, and Ma'ariv in Yiddish. And Jewish holiday is Monged in Judeo-Italian, because the Ayin is pronounced Nga, and Moed in Judeo-Spanish, and Yontif in Yiddish. Now, what do we do in Jewish English? Well, we have a lot of diversity because we have communities that came to the United States and to England and other English-speaking places speaking various languages with various Hebrew pronunciation traditions. So we could say Shabbat, Shabbos, or Sabbath. And we could say Mariv, Mariv, Ma'ariv, Ma'ariv, and Arvit. And we could say Yom Tov, Yontif, or Chag. And we certainly do have words from Hebrew to refer to religious concepts in Jewish English. But sometimes the words are used in interesting ways. I'm giving you a few examples here of how they're used within sentences, like Il Masa B'ta Afikumen, the matzah of the Afikoman, and Minyan Kuti joined the quorum or had his bar mitzvah in Judeo-Malayalam in southern India. In Judeo-Italian, mezuzah means a mezuzah that is posted on the doorpost, but it also can mean metaphorically a beautiful woman because she's someone that one would want to kiss, at least the person who is saying that sentence. And Jewish English, we have similar metaphorical uses like a shehechianu moment. So the blessing, shehechianu, is a blessing that is said at a special occasion. And so if you say this is a shehechianu moment, it is a special occasion. Now, in addition to religious items and concepts, we have secret language. Hebrew and Aramaic loanwords are used to make sure that some people don't understand what is said, specifically non-Jews. And so here's a sentence from Yiddish: Daber nicht, der Orel is maven kol dibber. It literally means don't speak, the uncircumcised one understands every word. But you see that the big words, daber, orel, kol, maven, kol, and dibber, are all from Hebrew. And only the grammatical words, nicht, der, is, those are from German. And so somebody who speaks German wouldn't be able to understand this if they don't also know Hebrew. So who might use a sentence like this? It would be somebody who wants to warn another Jew that a non-Jew nearby speaks German, because most of the people around would speak Slavic languages and not necessarily understand German. And so if they wanted to hide something from someone who does speak German, they could use Hebrew words in a secretive way like this. And this is the case in many Jewish languages. We don't really have this in Jewish English to the same extent, but we do have some evidence that some people use Hebrew, full sentences in Hebrew, when they don't want people to understand, because now that Hebrew has been revitalized and revernacularized in Israel, people around the world, Jews around the world, can use that if they speak Hebrew as a secretive language. But we do have some interesting words for non-Jews. So along these same lines, there are words for non-Jewish holiday and non-Jew and Jesus in various Jewish languages. And these were created at a time when the relations between Jews and non-Jews were not so friendly. And so, for example, Jesus is often referred to by a euphemism, ludo, that one, or oto ha'ish, that man. And Jewish English has this to some extent, but much less. We don't have a word for general non-Jewish holiday, but some Orthodox Jews refer to Christmas as kratzmach, which is kind of offensive. It literally means scratch me. It's kind of a euphemistic way of referring to Christmas for people who don't want to say that word, and also a secretive way. And we do have some words for non-Jew, like goy and shiksa. And there is a joking way to refer to Jesus, which is yoshke, and some see that as an offensive way of referring to Jesus. So we also have Hebrew and Aramaic words that are used for euphemism. For example, in Judeo-Greek, ruchoth means airs or also farts. Rimonim means pomegranates and also breasts. Tachath means under and also rear end. In Judeo-Arabic, bit kabud means house of honor, but also toilet. Maim qatanim means small water, but it also means urine. And beit chaim means house of life, literally, but it also means cemetery. And you see similar euphemisms in many Jewish languages. We have this to some extent. And also in Yiddish, we have a number of interesting examples. Ge'enaf nekovim means to go to the bathroom. Literally, it means to go to holes. From the blessing nikavim nekavim that mentions how grateful we are to God that our holes all work properly. And nekovim kitanim is number one, and nekavim gedolim is number two. And my favorite, asher yotzer papir, something that we're all concerned about these days, not having enough toilet paper. Asher yotzer papir is from the blessing that is said after the toilet, the asher yatzar blessing. So we also have this to some extent in Jewish English. At some Jewish summer camps, they refer to their bathroom as the bik, or the beit hakiseh, the house of the chair. That is a euphemism for bathroom that is kind of archaic. Another euphemism is saying that somebody was nifter, that they died, niftar. And then we also have some euphemisms that come not from Hebrew, but from Yiddish. Pish and kaki, for example. Well, kaki can also be from Hebrew, from modern Hebrew, influenced by Yiddish. And then influenced a modern Hebrew word, shilshul, for diarrhea. So we certainly have a lot of non-English words used by Jews as euphemisms, including some Hebrew words. You didn't expect to come to an academic lecture and hear about these bathroom functions, did you? Okay, then we also have Hebrew and Aramaic words that don't have real life reference, that don't fit into any of these categories. For example, in Judeo-German or Western Yiddish, bekitzer, meaning briefly or in some, tekef umiyad, immediately. Judeo-Arabic, afilu, even so, or vadai, of course. And we have a number of these in Jewish English. Are you going for the learning or stam for the social scene? Thursday night's not a good night, bichlal. If you're going, then kal v'chomer, I should go. Enough with the big ideas. Let's get down to tachlis. Now, these are all sentences that would be used by Jews who are engaged in Jewish communities. Another type of Hebrew influence in contemporary Jewish language is words from modern Hebrew, from Israel. And this hasn't been going on too long because Hebrew was only revernacularized in the last century or so. And so we have a number of words in Jewish English and contemporary Jewish Hungarian, Jewish Swedish, Jewish Latin American Spanish. Here are some examples from Jewish English. Some words like kippah, which does appear in the texts, in our textual Hebrew, but not in the same meaning as a skull cap. And kol hakavod, yofi. Kol hakavod means good job. Yofi means nice. Matzav meaning the situation. Tiyul meaning a hike. Shilshul, diarrhea, which I mentioned before. We also have influences from Israeli Hebrew in pronunciation. Like instead of saying Yom Kippur, saying Yom Kippur. Now that is not pronounced exactly as it is in modern Hebrew, but it is more similar in the structure of the syllables than it was in the Yiddish that first influenced Yom Kippur. And Sukkot rather than Sukkos, mitzvot rather than mitzvahs. We also have a click from modern Hebrew, like this. We were walking around and it doesn't matter. Did you hear that click over Zoom? So that is an influence from modern Hebrew where that click is used alongside a different click, which is the no click. It's like this. Do you want to buy this? That's a different click. It's done in a slightly different mouth position versus, okay. So then we have this so, which is used in an interesting way. I've been using so the last few sentences just to get you on your toes, but I've used it in a different way than this usage. This usage is, if you've heard this, so you know what I'm talking about. That usage is not grammatical in standard English, but it is quite common in Orthodox Jewish English and among people who have spent time in Israel, and it's an influence from Israeli Hebrew. Now, another aspect of Hebrew and Aramaic words in Jewish English, in Jewish languages, is double phrases. Phrases that use a Hebrew word and a correlate word in the language. So for example, in Eastern Yiddish, mayim achronim vaser, meaning hand washing after the meal, but literally it means last water, water. And Jewish Neo-Aramaic, gintid gan eden, which means Garden of Eden. And Judeo-Arabic from Sefru, heluf hazir, meaning pig, pig. Or Judeo-Italian, boni ma'asim tovim, good deeds. Or Ladino, prove ani, meaning poor, poor, but meaning very poor. And Western Yiddish, ikgute simmetove, a good sign, a good sign. Now we do have this to some extent in Jewish English. For example, cholav Yisrael, milk. That means milk, Yisrael, milk that is prepared by Jews. And when people say, I got to get some cholav Yisrael milk, they're not thinking, oh, I'm saying the same word twice, the cholav and the milk, but it is just a common thing in Jewish languages to use Hebrew words in this way. So we've finished talking about the Hebrew and Aramaic component, although there's certainly a lot more that can be said about that. And we move on to the next common attribute of Jewish languages, which is influences from a previous Jewish language. In Ladino, some of the previous Jewish languages are Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Greek. For example, the way you say Sunday in Spanish is domingo, but that means the Lord. And so Jews felt uncomfortable saying the Lord's Day for Sunday because that's not the Sabbath in Jewish life. So instead they used a word from Arabic or Judeo-Arabic that was spoken by the ancestors of those who learned Spanish. And they said Ahad, meaning the one, the first day, because Sunday is the first day of the week. And a word from Judeo-Greek that was passed down through the generations and became common in Ladino is meldar, which means to read or study Torah. And in fact, this word is still used in Jewish English today among people with Ladino-speaking ancestors, especially in the Sephardic community in Seattle, where meldado means yortzeit. It means the anniversary of someone's death, because it is an occasion for gathering to read, to study Torah. In Yiddish, the previous Jewish language, the language that was spoken by the ancestors of those who eventually learned the Germanic language of Yiddish, is Judeo-Romance, and especially Judeo-Italian and Judeo-French. So from Judeo-Italian, we get the word bench. This is probably one of my favorite Jewish words because it comes from the Italian word benedice, which means to bless. Now, why didn't they just say the German word, which was segnen? Because it also meant to make the sign, as in make the sign of the cross. And Jews didn't feel comfortable using this word for bless. And so instead, they used the word that was used by some of their great-grandparents or grandparents, benedice, and then it eventually became bench. And of course, we still use this in Jewish English today to mean bless or say grace after meals. And another word from Judeo-Romance, in this case, likely Judeo-French, is cholent, which comes from the French chalent, which means to heat, like related to the word caliente. And that is the word for the warm Sabbath meal. It's warmed over a long period of time. And there are many words in Jewish languages for the warm Sabbath meal that mean something like warm, like chamin in Judeo-Arabic. Now, of course, Jewish English has a lot of these. Yiddish and Ladino don't have that many because they're so far removed from the previous Jewish language, but Jewish English is only a generation or two or three removed from the mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish. And so Yiddish is our primary previous Jewish language that influences Jewish English. And I'm not going to get into the many words from Yiddish that are used in Jewish English now, because I'll be talking about that in a subsequent lecture. But we also have other previous Jewish languages. I mentioned Ladino, that was spoken by some immigrants to communities, especially in Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, etc. And so some Sephardic communities maintain some of these Ladino words. And some Syrian communities maintain many words from Judeo-Arabic. And of course, Russian and Farsi feature prominently in the language of more recent immigrant communities from Russia and Iran. But these are not the only things that distinguish Jewish languages from the way their non-Jewish neighbors speak. There are also other distinctive features. For example, in Ladino, instead of saying verde for green, you say vedre. That has nothing to do with a Hebrew influence or an influence from Judeo-Greek or anything like that. It's just a natural occurrence that happens in language in general. Or in Judeo-Arabic in Iraq, instead of pronouncing the sound sh like their Muslim neighbors, they pronounced it s. Or in Jewish Neo-Aramaic in Kurdistan, there are many different words and grammatical features and pronunciations that are so different from the way that Christians speak this Aramaic language. For example, here are some communities in Kurdistan, and you can see that the Christian community has a lot of differences from the Jewish communities. The Jewish communities have some differences from each other, but they tend to be more similar to each other than to the Christians. Now, what about Jewish English? Well, we see more of these distinctive features in Orthodox communities than outside of Orthodox communities. For example, in the videos that I showed you at the beginning, you probably heard some distinctive pronunciations. In consonants, you might have heard releasing the T at the end of the word more than most people would, like saying right instead of right, or devoicing, like saying beard instead of beard, or distinctive vowel pronunciations, like saying o instead of o and u instead of u, and saying a instead of for candle, like saying candle as candle. And you may have noticed distinctive intonation. If you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. Now that's kind of a drastic version of this. It's a chanting intonation that is influenced by Talmud study. But you also get that in more subtle ways, like just if you're going to the store, get me some milk, like that, a little more subtle, distinctive intonation. But it's not just Orthodox Jews that have distinctive features. I did a survey in 2008, which I'll be talking about in a subsequent lecture, and I found that Jews who were not from New York were more likely than non-Jews who were not from New York to report having New York pronunciations. Like, for example, I say orange and Florida and horrible, and my kids make fun of me for it. And I'm not even from New York. I didn't grow up in New York, but my parents did. So I think that had an influence. Well, my parents didn't totally grow up in New York. They moved to LA, but anyway. So that certainly influenced my pronunciation, but I don't think it was just because my parents were from New York. I think it has become a Jewish feature that a lot of Jews around the country use New York pronunciations because of the prominence of New York in our historical trajectory. Another feature common among Jews of many backgrounds is overlapping. Now, you might have heard people saying that Jews interrupt. And I would say we don't interrupt, we overlap. We don't quite wait until the previous statement is finished before we start our statement. That overlap there might be interpreted by some as interrupting, but there is definitely some interesting research on this by Deborah Tannen. She did a thesis on a Thanksgiving dinner that had some Jewish guests and some non-Jewish guests, and she found that the Jews, see that intonation there, did more of this overlapping than the non-Jews, and the non-Jews were sometimes offended or felt like they were being steamrolled in the conversation. So yes, we Jews do have some distinctive features, but they are not as drastic as completely different pronunciations, completely different grammatical systems. And so our language tends to be more similar to that of non-Jews than many Jewish languages throughout history. On the other hand, there have also been several Jewish languages historically that did not have very distinctive language as far as we know. For example, Judeo-Persian and Judeo-French in the Middle Ages, the historical records that we have of these languages indicate that Jews were speaking quite similarly to non-Jews, although we don't have recordings, so we won't know for sure. Now, the final feature of Jewish languages that I want to talk about is the Hebrew writing system. I showed you some excerpts before of translations of the Bible into Jewish languages, and you saw that they were written in Hebrew letters. Jewish English is mostly not written in Hebrew letters. As you can see from this sentence here, we tend to write it in English letters. However, there are a few interesting exceptions to this. Sometimes Hebrew words are inserted into English sentences in Hebrew letters. For example, this is a poster from Agudath Israel, and you see that the Hebrew words are inserted in Hebrew letters within the English sentence. Or in pedagogical materials, this is quite common as well. But we also see this in some commodified situations. For example, this is Mini Market Plus. This is a grocery store in Williamsburg. And this is, in an Orthodox neighborhood in Brooklyn. And we also see this on some products. For example, this says pancake mix in Hebrew letters. And then it has Hebrew instructions and information on there as well. And we also see this in Bedikas Chometz Set, written in English letters, and Bedikas Chometz Set, written in Hebrew letters with Yiddish spelling conventions. This one has modern Hebrew spelling conventions. And this goes back many decades. We see a lot of this in the early and mid 20th century in Yiddish publications, where advertisements often had English words written in Hebrew letters in Yiddish spelling conventions. So this one is Planters High Het Peanut Oil. And then in Yiddish down below, it says Kosher LePesach Gesund ganz Jahr. Kosher for Passover and healthy the entire year. And then it says ways to better Passover meals. Oifanim verbessere Pesach Meicholim. So you certainly get a little bit of the English in Hebrew letters, or we might even say Yiddish orthography. And here's some more exceptions. Some Jewish nonprofit organizations use Hebrew letters to write their names or the names of a program, like this one is Jewlicious, and this one says Green Team. These are English words written in Hebrew letters, but note they're only done in symbolic ways. Most of the correspondence from these organizations is written in English letters. Or here's some other examples that I found at Jewish summer camps. This one says Umbrella. It's a location at camp that's called the Umbrella. And this one I think was probably just tongue-in-cheek. Let us all say Amen. This one was from Masad, Manitoba, and this one was from Ramah Poconos. And we certainly get this in political buttons and bumper stickers. This one says Trump in Hebrew letters, and this one says Joe Biden in Hebrew letters, although it's kind of strange. It really should be a little chick-chock instead of a yud. Right now it says Giu Biden. And then here in the faux Hebrew lettering, it says Jews for Joe. And of course, we have this historically as well. This one says Clinton, Barack Obama, Nixon, and this one is my favorite. It says Gore, and then under the picture of Bush, it says Gore nisht, meaning not Gore, but also Yiddish for nothing. And this is an example of how Jews can be described as the people of the pun. There is a lot of wordplay in Jewish culture, historically and also today. We also get Hebrew letters in college shirts and mugs and other material culture, like this one says Arizona State, this one is Alabama, Northwestern, and this one is a visual pun. It's Ohio. It has an O, English O's on either side of the Hebrew word chai. And I don't have any relationship to these universities. I just chose them to represent universities in various parts of the country. We also get this with sports teams. For example, Seattle Seahawks, Go Giants, Yankees, Chicago Bulls. And so these are the names of the sports teams in Hebrew letters. And we do get some of that Hebrew letter writing of English that we found in other Jewish languages in some pedagogical materials, although it's quite rare. So these are some pedagogical materials from the Reform movement. The one on the right of the screen is from the mid-20th century, from the 50s, before the Reform movement switched over to modern Hebrew pronunciation. And this was a textbook that attempted to teach Hebrew reading for liturgical purposes using English words. So it's called Rocket to Mars, and it's about Audrey and Mark going to Mars, and they start to speak Mars language, which is this. Let's begin. Audrey spoke this. Notice they can't do this in Hebrew letters because there's no the sound. This rocket ship is beginning to make real speed. Yes, indeed, Mark said. Soon it will be coming into the rocket station on moon number 2. Okay, so you see that this would be a fun way for kids to learn how to read Hebrew. Now, this method didn't last. This textbook didn't become the most popular textbook for decades, but I did see a more recent example of this in a Reform religious school where the teacher just impromptu wrote this practice sheet for her students. I have loved being your Mora. Notice Mora because it's a part of Jewish English to refer to the teacher as Mora, meaning teacher. I hope you'll practice your prayers over Samer. And so this was an exercise for the students to help them with their Hebrew reading skills. Now, why is Jewish English mostly written in English letters? Well, two major reasons. One is because of Jews' greater integration into society than many Jewish communities of the past, but also, and I think this is probably the most important reason, because of higher general literacy rates, that Jews in America today and around the world today tend to be literate in the local language because most people are literate in the local language in the industrialized world. And this has not been the case historically. In the times when most Jewish languages were codified, their writing systems in the Middle Ages and early modern period, most people were not literate in Arabic or Spanish or German. And so Jews also mostly were not literate, but those who were learned in Jewish school systems and learned with Hebrew alphabets. And so when Jews today learn to write English, they learn it in their public or private schools in English letters. So it's really not that surprising that Jews do not write English in Hebrew letters, with those few exceptions that I mentioned. Now, some people say that because contemporary Jews don't write their languages in Hebrew letters, their languages don't count as Jewish languages. And they say that Jewish English is not as distinct as Yiddish and Ladino, and therefore it doesn't count as a Jewish language. Now, they're certainly right. Jewish English is not as distinct as Yiddish and Ladino. If we're using Yiddish and Ladino as the models for what is a Jewish language, then they're right. Jewish English shouldn't count, but neither should Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Persian and Judeo-Provençal and Judeo-Malayalam. So I propose a new understanding of Jewish languages. I say that Yiddish and Ladino are actually exceptions in Jewish linguistic history because most Jewish communities have spoken a language that's somewhat similar to the language around them. In general, Jews tend to speak that language with the selective use of a repertoire of distinctive features, those influences from Hebrew and from other Jewish languages that were spoken before immigration, and other distinctive features that have developed because Jews have maintained some degree of separation from the local society. So I propose a continuum of Jewish linguistic distinctiveness, from the least distinct to the most distinct in relation to what their non-Jewish neighbors speak. So Judeo-French and Judeo-Persian might be on the less distinct side of this continuum. Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Italian somewhere in the middle, maybe Jewish Neo-Aramaic around here, and Yiddish and Ladino, the most distinct from the Slavic languages and the Ottoman languages spoken by their non-Jewish neighbors. So where does Jewish English fit on this continuum? Well, it depends whose Jewish English we're talking about. I would say secular Jewish English is all the way at this end. It's the least distinct. Let's say they might use a few words like bris, I went to my nephew's bris, or I lit a Yortzeit candle for my bubby or something like that. And then religious non-Orthodox Jews would use some Hebrew and Yiddish words and maybe some overlapping, but they probably wouldn't be that distinct. Orthodox Jewish English, as you saw from the videos I showed you, is quite distinct. And then Hasidic Yiddish is all the way on this end, because of course there are many Jews in America and England and other English-speaking countries who do not speak English as their primary language and instead speak Yiddish. So yes, my answer is American Jews do speak a Jewish language, and so do Jews throughout Europe. Jewish English, Jewish French, Russian, German, Hungarian, Dutch, Swedish, and Latin America, Jewish Spanish and Portuguese, and throughout the English-speaking world, Jewish English. So Jews around the world today are continuing the millennia-long tradition of speaking a variety of the local language with distinctive features. And this really allows Jews to connect to other Jews locally when they share a lexicon and distinctive linguistic features. It also connects Jews to other Jews around the world who are doing similar things. Jews who are borrowing from modern Hebrew and from Yiddish and other historical migration Jewish languages and textual Hebrew. And it connects Jews to Jews throughout history who have done similar things. And I encourage you to learn more about all of the phenomena that I'm talking about at the Jewish language website, jewishlanguages.org. And there you can also sign up to be on our mailing list to find out about future events. And I also encourage you to check out the Jewish English Lexicon, which you can also find a link to at that website, which lists over 1,000 words that are used by Jews within English, words from Hebrew and Yiddish, but also Judeo-Arabic and Ladino and other languages. Thank you very much. I'm going to be open now to questions.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. We are going to do some questions, but before we do, I just want to say I've been in a lot of Zoom rooms lately, working for this project, Jewish Live. That was just such a beautiful presentation and so smoothly given, and right from the videos at the top, which is not an easy thing to do, to share videos properly with the sound and all that. Like, this is gorgeous and I'm learning so much. So I am going to jump to some of the questions. I want to start with one that's actually very short and sweet. And I want to give it to you mostly because I'm curious how you'd respond to this. But the question is, I won't give too many more at trust. The question is, how many languages do you speak? And I'm curious what your response would be.
Oh, well, that's a question I get a lot, because when people hear that I'm a linguist, they say, oh, you must speak dozens of languages. No, I speak English, Jewish English pretty well, although I didn't understand a lot of those baseball commentary quotes. But I speak some Hebrew and Yiddish, enough to get by, and a little bit of French and Spanish. That's it. I mean, when I was doing my PhD in linguistics, I only needed to take a test in one language and write a paper on about another language, because linguists aren't learning languages, they're learning how to analyze languages.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could have a long tangent just from that question on like another conversation about what counts as a language.
As a language.
Because like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because if certain things count, then you speak lots more. Okay, so we've got a two-part question. This is a little bit lengthier. We'll switch from the quick one to the longer one. So students of medieval French have relied on Rashi's occasional use of French or Judeo-French because his transliteration of French words into Hebrew letters helps to reveal French pronunciation of his day, especially in French with so many silent letters that may have changed their phonetics over the centuries. Is there any similar phenomenon today where students of a given language in its non-Jewish form rely on a Jewish dialect of that language in order to shed light on that language's development?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I just read a book that talks a lot about this that's going to be coming out in a few months, and I highly recommend it. It's a book for the general public, not geared toward academics, called Jewish Languages A to Z, or A to Z, depending on which author it is. It's by Lily Kahn from England and Aaron Rubin from the US. And actually, one thing that I learned from that is that the first instance of the word pizza in Italian was actually in Hebrew letters, Pe Yud Tzadi He, in a Jewish text. And that is very relevant for today, the end of Passover, where we're all munching on pizza and excited to be eating chametz again. And that is an example of how scholars sometimes look to the Jewish text to find out how languages were pronounced a long time ago. And yes, so several languages have that, a number of Romance languages, and I'm not sure how many, but I recommend reading that book to find out more about it. It will be out in, I think, in the fall.
Great. So we have a couple more. Oh, there's really good ones. And for the questions we don't get to, folks, I will save them and send and make sure that Sarah has them. And to the extent you're able, maybe you can address those in the future or something. But so one great question. This was asked about 10 minutes ago, so it was in the context of what you were saying then. I'm trying to capture, but is this, and this is not totally clear to me, but is this limited to diaspora communities which are large and self-confident? I think this is talking about the extent.
No, yeah, I see that that person wrote in the chat also that it has to do with the t-shirts and campaign buttons.
Oh, cool. So yeah,
okay.
so
so I would say I don't know. I don't know if Jews in England and New Zealand have campaign buttons and t-shirts like that. It's a great question, and I would love to know from people who live in those places. But certainly Jews in those countries do speak Jewish English. And in fact, on the Jewish English lexicon, we have a function where you can sort by location. And most of the words that are on there are listed as just used in North America because that's the data that I have on them. And I rely on people from England, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand to let me know if words are used in those locations. And I'm always looking for people from those countries to provide more entries. And I've learned so many things from entries that people contribute. Like, for example, the word kitke means challah in South Africa. And kugel in South Africa means kugel, a noodle dish, but it also is a way to refer to what people in America might call a Jewish American princess, a Jap. So really interesting uses of words in these countries that come from Yiddish or from Hebrew or other languages that are different. Another one in England is yuk, which means non-Jew, and likely comes from Cockney slang of goy said backwards, and then the G becomes a K. So some really interesting language that happens in those countries.
Cool. We've got one question about, this is a historical question about the Reform movement, and I'm always fascinated by this question. So you mentioned the Reform movement switching to and this is in quotes, to an Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew. When did this happen and why? What did it mean for Americans switching to the Israeli pronunciation and for Americans, what did it mean for Americans who were switching to the Israeli pronunciation and for Americans who weren't?
Great, yeah. So it happened in the mid-1960s. Now, some people assume that it happened after 1967, which was a turning point in Jewish history when Jews became more proud of Israel and proud of their Jewishness, in line with the trends in America more generally of becoming more proud of ethnic distinctiveness. But in the Reform movement, it happened a little bit earlier in like 1965, 1966. The Reform movement started to become more engaged with Israel, and many of the institutions switched over to that, to teaching that pronunciation and using that pronunciation in that time. but of course, many elderly people continued to use the Ashkenazi pronunciations that they know, and that's why a common popular depiction of people saying the Kaddish is Yiskadal v'Yiskadash instead of Yitkadal v'Yitkadash, because many elderly people, even today, still use those pronunciations. And so in the transition in the reform movement, it had to do with increasing Zionism and also with more increased pride in Jewishness within America that influenced not just the pronunciation, but the greater usage of words from Hebrew. Okay, I think
sorry, yeah. I was just I had the Q&A open and that got in the way of the mute button. Okay, so we've got time for just, I think, one more, unfortunately, and I will send you the ones that we don't quite get to. And this is, how does Jewish English in the US compare to the languages of other, and I'm going to add to the languages or dialects or any of those kinds of terms of other ethnic or immigrant groups?
Yeah, great. Well, the way that immigrant groups in America speak usually only last for a generation or two. After 2 generations, usually you don't really have a distinctive way of speaking Polish English or German English, although there are some exceptions, the media depictions of Italian Americans speaking in a distinctive way, right? And then, of course, there are racial groups, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and there is a lot of research on the language used by these groups. And the way that African Americans speak in particular is much more distinct from general American English than Jewish English is. And of course, there's a diversity in each of them. So to speak African American English, you might just use a few distinctive features, or you might speak in a way that is completely different. And that is the case with Orthodox Jews as well. Some Orthodox Jews might use just a few distinctive features, and others might use very distinctive pronunciation and grammatical features. But I would say overall, African American English and Latino English are more different from general American English than Jewish English. And there's also different power dynamics, because Jews are generally not marginalized groups in America, with the exceptions of increasing anti-Semitism. Jews do not tend to hide their distinctive language in certain situations. And Jews tend to be highly educated, although in Orthodox communities, often not in secular subjects. So it's a really interesting question of comparative analysis, and I thank you for that question. And I know we're out of time, so I just want to say, please look at the Jewish language website at the events tab for the other lectures in this webinar series. And I want to thank Lex and Jewish Live for providing the platform for this and for inviting me to present these lectures.
And thank you for bringing this beautiful wisdom. This has been such a great kickoff. We're so excited for the next 5. So the total of 6, 5 more coming up, sessions all on Thursdays, same time, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Fill it in, 5 Mountain, 6 Central, all the time zones. If there's Israelis on here, a bunch of hours into the AM. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you out there viewing. There were a couple of questions about why you can't see everybody. Unfortunately, we can't have all of our programming in meeting format where you can see everybody for a variety of security reasons and otherwise. I just wanted to explain why that was, but we really appreciate you coming and interacting with questions and all of that. Please share that this is happening with your friends. If you came to this meeting, you have the option of receiving reminders of the future ones, and we hope that you'll come back. We hope that you'll tell your friends, and we hope that you'll check out other Jewish Live programs at jewishlive.org. You can see a whole list of our existing programs at a page, jewishlive.org/originals, for our original shows. This will soon be up there. Because this was the first episode, it's not there yet. But this episode will be up there very soon, and future episodes will also be housed there in case you miss one. And so then they're also going to be available through the Jewish Language Project, which you should totally check out. So with that, we are going to close this out. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to any of you out there on Facebook Live watching this, on Vimeo, on the Jewish Live website, and all of you in the Zoom room. This has been fun. Let's keep talking in all the languages that we're talking in. So have a good night and an early Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Thank you.